Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out. As George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In this period of unrest, misinformation, and dictatorships, looking back at history is a good way to put current events into perspective and hopefully make better choices. Jason Stanley's new book, Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, looks at how the authoritarian movement on the right is focusing its energies and its attempts to roll back gains on civil rights, equity, and inclusion by targeting schools. In order for democracy to thrive, we need a common understanding of reality, a shared view of what has happened, so that we as ordinary citizens can make strong decisions for the future. So this evening's author is Jason Stanley. He's the author of 6 books, contributor to many publications, including the New York Times and The Guardian, and is a professor at Yale University. He will be in conversation this evening with Ethan Kleinberg, editor-in-chief of History and Theory Journal, author of several books himself, and a professor of history and letters at Wesleyan University. Just so you all know, there will be time at the end of their conversation for some audience questions and to purchase this fabulous book. So without further ado, Jason and Ethan.
Check, check. Everybody hear me? So I'm Ethan Kleinberg. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thank you to Jason for this opportunity to discuss the book. Here, got props right here. You can all see it. Excuse me one sec. I'm going to do a lens change. Now I think about it. This is how I know I'm aging.
There are other ways to tell, too.
Well, I didn't know it was a comedy routine. So I thought I'd start off, well, first of all, sort of just prefacing how important I think it is for a book like this to be out right now that discusses the topic of erasing or overwriting historical narratives in an attempt to silence some voices while promoting or advocating others. And I think it's very provocative, and we can talk about this, about the argument that it's coming to the fore most so in the service of fascist political ends. But in full disclosure, Jason and I were on a panel recently, last spring, at Wesleyan for a book that was about this question about fascism in America. And it really, by the end of the conversation, it felt like we were arguing over how many angels were dancing on the head of a pin, what's fascism, what isn't fascism, how you decide what fascism is. And I don't think it ended up being very productive because, of course, there's many ways academics could parse this and many ways you could discuss it. There's the famous joke about if it's not Italian, it's just sparkling authoritarianism. That's sort of what it felt like. And to my mind, I more see the use of fascism in the previous book and this book, not so much a question of whether it's, whether you're trying to make a historical mandate on how other people use it, but actually it's an authorial and rhetorical choice. And so I thought maybe we could start and put the fascism question to rest by asking you to elaborate on why you made the choice of fascism as opposed to the more general term authoritarianism, which I think everyone would agree on, and what you think the work that it does in moving the conversation forward.
So, first of all, I've heard about Westport Library and the avid audiences, and it's wonderful to be here and in conversation with Ethan, who's one of the intellectuals I've most admired in recent years. So let me address this question by noting some commentary on Trump's recent remarks about immigrants bringing bad genes into the country. And I saw a number of commentators describe this as authoritarianism, which is just funny because Castro wouldn't really do that, like, it's fascism. Like, what the hell are people talking about? Sorry, what the heck are people talking about? I mean, it is purely out of Mein Kampf. It is not, there are like 100 different versions of authoritarianism where you wouldn't say that. So, monarchy, you wouldn't say that. Communism, you wouldn't say that. Stalin wouldn't say it. It's fascism. And if you don't know what your target is, what kind of authoritarianism you're dealing with, you're not going to have the right remedy. Fascists say Democrats are Marxists. The first people the Nazis imprisoned in the newly built concentration camps were social democrats, because they were Marxists. So if you have a group of people talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of the nation and that Yale University is filled with Marxists, I've yet to meet one, but I've only been there a dozen years. If you have people saying that basically anyone who opposes them is a Marxist and speaks this way about immigrants, it's just totally incorrect to call it, if you're labeling it accurately, calling it authoritarianism is so general, you may as well just call it's a political viewpoint.
Well, there's more to say about that, but I'd rather turn actually to the heart of the book, and in particular, I want to look at something that you write on page 5, which I find is a particularly powerful statement, one I completely agree with, and I think worth stating. You say, history is the study of not just people and events, but also the practices, structures, and institutions that shape them. Without accounting for these forces, history is rendered flat and malleable, ideal for manipulation by fascist politics. And I was hoping you could actually expand on this, drawing on some of the examples you use in the book to talk about, well, maybe the possibility of the more thicker version or more full version, but also then what this flattened ideological version looks like.
Right. A warning that you don't want the flattened ideological version is that Hitler very clearly recommends it in Mein Kampf. He says, we've lost the art of education, teaching the few great men of the nation. We should teach the great men of the nation so that people look to Germans and Aryans and say, they are the great men, our nation is great because of these great men. And then Hitler says we should represent the Reich as the successor of Greece and Rome. All of this sounds familiar to me. This idea of representing history as great men, well, as you know, it's what Howard Zinn challenges in people's history. And democracy requires agency. Like democratic education gives citizens the sense that they can change history, that it's not just great men who change history. And it's vital. A democratic education gives agency to people, tells people that social movements did change things. And if you want to eliminate democracy, don't teach social movements. Don't give people the sense that hierarchies are permanent and history is made by a few great men. I mean, one erasure that I should talk about more in the book, and to my regret I don't, is the complete erasure of women in the education with which we were raised. It's no accident that patriarchy reigns when you're educated, when you're given textbooks where there are no women agents in history. I mean, I suppose we must have learned about Joan of Arc, but that kind of erasure underlies the patriarchal structures of American society.
So I want to follow that up. Actually, I'm going to jump because it opens something up that I think is really interesting. So one of the aspects that you seem to champion in the book is what I would call perspectivalism, and you can see that in the answer you just gave, the idea that and it's surely laudable, it is a thicker and more full history when women's voices of minorities, voices of persecuted people are accounted for. And I think that you do a lot of very good work in the book trying to discuss the way we could bring back the voices and the actions precisely to see that they have intent and that they have agency, especially of marginalized people, the forgotten voices, or what Walter Benjamin called the losers of history. So I would be interesting to hear you elaborate a little bit more with some specifics about the way you see the fascist regime seeking to silence these voices, and actually not even necessarily regimes of the past, but more so the ones that are around today in India. That's one case you give. Another one you discuss, of course, Russia. And then there are instances in the United States.
And Israel.
And Israel, of course. But I'm also interested in a criticism that we were just discussing backstage. That's the possibility that when you have such a multiplicity of accounts, it actually disables or deactivates political solidarity, pitting these particular historical accounts against one another, or even if they're not actively against one another, keeping them, any one of them, from having a particularly large political reach or power. So I guess those would be two separate sorts of trajectories.
As I do often in the book, I'm going to draw on my father's wisdom and work. My father was a sociology professor, and I do draw a lot on his work, and a Holocaust survivor, and I do draw a lot on his work in this book. He was very dismissive of the concept of unity. He said, he essentially in his work regarded unity as a kind of, I mean, this is a familiar critique of positive freedom, right? Berlin and Isaiah Berlin. But he essentially regarded the idea of unity as a kind of authoritarianism. And, which is a familiar criticism in democratic political theory. That was made of Rousseau. So he said, instead, we need civic compassion. We need an understanding of where other people are coming from. Instead of a single identity, a single unity, we need a solidarity formed by understanding that other people also went through the world, and they went through the world in different ways. And so that kind of compassion for other people's journey is what should underlie a democracy, and not a faux unity. Because anytime you bring in this idea that we all have to share a common identity, the common identity is almost always going to be enforced from above. And so it's not going to be organic. Whereas a sense of where other citizens are coming from does connect us to them. And without that sense, we don't have democracy. Because democracy is a system where each of us plays a role in the formation of the laws that govern us. That is freedom. That is freedom in a society where we can live together and still be free. This is Rousseau's great idea, that each of us has a role to play in the laws that govern us. Otherwise, you're not free. You're obeying somebody else's laws. But it's not just a matter of voting, because if there's a minority group, I have to have their perspective influence my vote. Because a minority group, a democracy isn't a tyranny of the majority. A democracy does have a solidarity to it. And the question is the nature and character of that solidarity. And the nature and character of that solidarity can't be a faux unity that will be imposed from above. It has to be something like, I understand what you've gone through, and that makes me feel that this society is unjust and this society is worse, even though I didn't go through it. And so my vote will be affected by your journey, and not just my journey, because your journey is my journey. And so that's what you're trying to do in a democracy. Martin Luther King didn't get people to move, didn't get white people to move by like expanding the number of black people. He got them to move by saying, look at what's happening to us. And that should affect your vote. So that's why, so I'm against, you know, I talk about the concept of civic compassion, and I think that's what we need in a pluralistic democracy.
So empathy is doing a lot of work there for you, but maybe I can now come back to the first part of the question to talk about the way that's deactivated or disabled in other places, like, as you suggested, in India, in Russia.
Oh, right. Yeah. So this is going through textbooks of some of these countries that are descending into fascism or have already gotten there, as in the case of Russia, has been fascinating. I have to say, nothing is as blatantly nonsensical as the US textbooks from the mid-century. Like, you can look, the Nazi textbooks are not as crazy as like the US textbooks. They loved slavery, you know, the Nazi textbooks are more subtle than that. And India's textbooks, when BJP has changed the textbooks, the ruling party of India, to subtly tilt the national narrative towards Hinduism, right? And against, so representing Muslims as invaders. There's a shift in the description of Gandhi that one of the students I hired noticed, where they say Gandhi's main political interest, central political interest, was in getting India to pay reparations to Pakistan, thereby representing Gandhi as a traitor. I mean, he was for equality. That doesn't mean paying money to Pakistan. So these subtle, Russia is more explicit. Russia eliminates all independent history of Ukraine, and they represent Ukraine as they represent Ukraine. Well, they don't represent Ukraine at all. They just say it's Russia, and so they obviously don't talk about Holodomor, the intentional famine where millions of Ukrainians starved to death in the 1930s, and then they represent all of Russia's recent adventures in neighboring lands as justified by supporting independence, pro-Russian independence movements. So this is now we have in the U.S. we have an absolutely brutal attack on education. I mean, it's almost breathtaking, and the rapidity of it is breathtaking. Public school teachers, you know, under complete fire, being turned in by families, people debating whether criminal penalties, civil penalties for teaching structural racism, which is part of the history that's necessary to understand. Like, how do you understand the segregation of American cities? Most American cities have a poor black neighborhood. New Haven, my city, has a poor black neighborhood. My kids are always asking, my kids are black, they're like, how did that happen? So you need to talk about mortgage redlining. You need to talk about local tax bases for school districts. You need to talk about the structural factors that maintain racial hierarchies. You know, Black Americans weren't allowed loans to purchase houses, so they didn't pass on generational wealth, which is why the racial wealth gap is so enormous today. But you are literally not allowed to teach that in Florida's public schools. You're also, apparently, well, now you're not allowed to teach it in Tennessee's universities. Now, Indiana, home of the University of Indiana, one of the great public universities of the world, Indiana recently passed a law banning the teaching of divisive concepts like structural racism. So can you learn about mortgage redlining at the University of Indiana? It's not clear. So these are the kind of erasures that are happening. And looking at the matter, it seemed, obviously, in China, you can't teach about Tiananmen Square. It's obvious why in an authoritarian country you obliterate the history of social movements, right? But it's very dramatic what's happening in the United States right now. It's threatening the world's greatest university systems, and it's making the lives of public school teachers hell.
So one thing that I would like you to bring forward, because it goes to this empathy issue, or the ability for me to be able to understand where you're coming from different groups to understand. One of the arguments against teaching these so-called divisive concepts is it's going to make some students ashamed. Ashamed of what their ancestors did, or ashamed of what's happened, and thus they need to pull it back. And you make an interesting counter-argument about how that's a very one-sided understanding of shame. And I think it'd be useful to elaborate that here, because it really does point to what's happening in the United States as some states are making these sorts of decisions, arguing that it's in the benefit of some states.
Over 20 states are making these decisions. Now, first of all, since I'm Jewish, I'm going to begin with an obvious other country where this is going to have repercussions. I wonder what country, if they taught the history, would make people feel slightly guilty. So yes, Germany, Alternative für Deutschland is now what, the second largest party? And they're running on changing the education system so that people don't have to feel so ashamed about their past. Now, this is one reason I find that my fellow Jewish Americans supporting these divisive concept laws, I find it so shocking, because you are feeding this in Germany. The AfD is running on a platform to remove Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe from Berlin. Like this is exactly parallel to what is happening here. And they know it's exactly parallel because there was article after article about critical race theory and how evil it is in the German press. So, of course, you can't teach black history here becomes, you can't make white Americans ashamed becomes, you can't make Germans ashamed. So when I've confronted some, say, of my Orthodox relatives with this, they've first been stunned, and then like, oh yeah, I guess that's okay. Okay. Secondly, Toni Morrison, so enough rant about Germany. Toni Morrison said, in America, freedom often means what white people have versus what other people have. So to understand that point, think of the image of freedom that I grew up with in school. The settlers and the covered wagons going west, right? That was freedom, right? They were going into the uncharted wilderness. But wait, that's a notion of freedom that only makes sense given the indigenous genocide. So you can only understand that as freedom because it's contrasted with what was happening to the other people in the lands they were going into. So that's Toni Morrison's point. And you can see Toni Morrison's point very strongly, starkly in these divisive concept laws. Because who's going to feel shame if you're not allowed to teach about structural racism? Well, suppose you're a black child in a poor family, and you don't know why your family is poor. And if you're not taught about structural racism, if you're not taught about mortgage redlining, if you don't talk about mass incarceration, the legacy of Jim Crow, you're gonna think that your family is poor because they're lazy. You're going to feel shame about your family's situation. So the shame that is behind these divisive concept laws that have passed in more than 20 states, the shame here is only shame for white people. Another example, Moms for Liberty. Moms for Liberty doesn't want LGBTQ literature perspectives in schools. Now, how will that make, and they don't want critical race theory taught. They support the divisive concept laws, which are also about gender. How is that gonna make a child in an LGBTQ family feel if their parents' relationship is represented as obscene or decadent. That is going to make that child feel terrible. Or if they're an LGBTQ child themselves. So these concepts of shame, these concepts of liberty are, as Toni Morrison very clearly points out, they mean so often in America, white shame, white liberty.
That's very useful. So I want to turn actually to one of the most, what I found to be one of the most interesting chapters because of the way it means different things to different people. And this is the chapter that's on what you call classical education. And it's a fascinating chapter because it really does straddle this line between the possibility of a multiple generative historical understanding and a very flattened, homogeneous ideological one. And one reason that I found it such an interesting chapter is because despite the way you show quite clearly that these fascist groups are marshaling it precisely to say what should be taught in school, the classics, this meaning mostly Greek and Roman, and a kind of march up to Germany and then over the United States. Of course, them using it to that end, but also the fact that classical education and its locus in our modern university does have a very fraught past predicated on precisely these kind of essentialist, originalist notions of a hierarchy of culture against which other ones must be compared. And its fraught place in the history of education. Nevertheless, in the book, you also champion classical education because of the benefits that you think it could give. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that tension. I guess it's a sort of use and abuse of classical education question about how it's turned one way and how it can be used in this other light.
This is all academics' favorite chapter. I like it too. So yes, great. I mean, so I read my kids Plato's Republic, and now we're reading the Phaedo, which I feel is a mistake, but too Christian. So they're being exposed to classical education. I tried reading them Souls of Black Folk, but it begins by saying, how does it feel to be a problem? You know, Du Bois is saying, when you're black in America, you know, everyone treats you like you're a problem, and my kids were like, see, that's why we don't want a white guy reading us this book. So that was my attempt to get out of classical education, which failed. So I suppose Du Bois is now but which he would have appreciated. So there's kind of a mystery for someone like me who deeply appreciates classical education. As Ethan said, first of all, classical education is behind the civilization savagism paradigm that has motivated so many of the worst atrocities in human history. So, you know, the Belgian King Leopold was like, hey, the Congolese are, you know, savages, so we're gonna go rescue them and kill 10 million for rubber, because, you know, they're savages. So civilization savage, Hitler on the Slavs, the Nazis, you know, obviously indigenous genocide, slavery. So classical education buttresses that, right? Because classical education is like, oh, look, Greece and Rome, and, you know, we have these great, Shakespeare and Kant and Goethe. And it's not just that, it's that, you know, under the Nazi regime, classical education was funded like physics. It was like, you know, it was put on a pedestal. And even they loved Shakespeare, you know. So you really have to address this. You have to address this fact that, and then you have to address the worry that we present ourselves in very similar terms as the inheritors of Greece and Rome, which is exactly what the Nazis did. So I wrote this chapter trying to both explain what's going on, like Hillsdale College is advertising itself as bringing classical education. Ron DeSantis is saying we're going to bring classical education, and he just means Christian nationalism. And actually, Aristotle was not a Christian nationalist.
Nor was Plato.
Oh, nor was Plato.
So the Phaedo may not be as Christian as you're arguing.
Yeah, the Phaedo is really annoying for that reason, because it's very, very immortal soul. That's where Socrates is arguing for the immortal soul. So what I do in the chapter is I point out that, so Ron said the whole American right educational movement is like, we're taking away this indoctrination and replacing it with classical education, where classical education means something like in Oklahoma, where they're requiring that every single classroom has a Bible and every single teacher teaches out of the Bible, and they've ordered 55,000 Bibles in Oklahoma to get math classes and physics classes. Are going to have to teach out of the Bible. And the Bible, I don't know if you've seen this, but it looks like it's going to be 55,000 Trump Bibles, because the description of the Bible, it has to have the Constitution in it. So think of this, it's Christian nationalism. You put the US Constitution in the Bible, because of course God ordained the United States as the Christian nation. But the only Bible that fits those specifics is the Trump Bible. You can't make this stuff up. So none of this is classical education. In the symposium, in Plato's symposium, the model of love is an older male teacher and his younger male student, which is not as Hillsdale College as one might think. And they're always ranting, these Hillsdale College videos are always talking about how, classical education is the grounding for the nuclear family. In Plato, and Marx says you should take kids away from their families and the state should raise them. Actually, Plato says that in the Republic. All children should be taken away from their families and raised by the state. Then young people will be nice to old people because they don't know who their parents are, and old people will be nice to young people because they don't know who their kids are. That's the view. So it's this complete misappropriation of classical education. And as a fan of the classics, as a philosopher, it's horrifying to me to have classical education represented as simply Christian nationalist indoctrination, or as in the case of the Nazis, Nazi indoctrination. So I think, I don't use these terms in the chapter, but we can differentiate between a personalist use of classical education, where you're using classical education, Hitler's very clear about this, to create veneration for dead white men. The Nazis kind of read back Germanness. They had a kind of fictional construction of the white race. They said, well, the great Roman emperors were really German, and the ancient Greeks were kind of German, right? And so it's this reading back of whiteness backwards. So that's a personalist use. You're using classical education to venerate the identities of these people, and of course men. I want to say, both that classical education has these radical ideas. Like in Plato's Republic, Socrates encounters the objection, how can women be rulers, philosopher kings, philosopher rulers? They're biologically different from men, to which Plato's response is, a bald man and a man with hair are biologically different. Doesn't mean they both can't be rulers, so they can't do this one task. So there are radical ideas in classical education, in the classics, but one can't just teach classical education because there are radical ideas from all sorts of sources.
I'm all for the radical classical education. I'm down with that. So, because I'm not sure how much time we have, I do want to ask one question to try and kind of hold your feet to the fire a little bit.
Oh, no, ask the other question.
That one will come after, depending on the answer. Much of what you argue about the suppression, erasure, and selective use of history, I would say is not restricted to history as practiced by fascists or authoritarian regimes. And in fact, many of the examples that you provide, and you've even provided now, are from textbooks or they're either from or in textbooks in the United States under democratic rule. And so on my view, the argument could be made that the problem is not so much with how fascists use history, but that the discipline of history itself is particularly suitable for something like fascism because it was created in this 19th century moment of nationalism, exceptionalism. There's a healthy amount of eugenics involved or social Darwinism. This is to say that the problem lies with the logic of disciplinary history as practiced. And this is what makes it such a powerful tool, such a willing tool for fascists. I mean, this is a kind of the call is coming from inside the house sort of argument. So I'd like to hear your response to the proposal that the solution may not be to combat fascist history with more disciplinary history, which is more or less how it's set up in the book, but actually to change the way we think about the past and the coordinates by which we do history to more adequately account for those very actors to whom you want to give voice.
Yeah, I'm happy to blame you guys. That was a joke. I mean, you're a historian, an intellectual historian, so I just had a wow moment when you said that. I'm not surprised that a discipline, with roots in the 19th century when nationalism emerges after the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire, or causing the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire, a discipline rooted in vindicating nationalism and that just never occurred to me until this moment, Ethan. So I guess your reading of Howard Zinn is then Zinn is trying to change the discipline of he is changing the discipline of history from this very dangerous disciplinary route it has.
I mean, I would even go further to say that Zinn doesn't go far enough. He's still too beholden to the strategies of historicism and a logic of progress. But maybe that'll lead me to this next question. So in the chapter on reclaiming history, you discussed the 1619 Project, and this is Nicole Hannah-Jones. It was published first in the New York Times, then came out as its own sort of standalone book or series of chapters. And part of the purpose of this, or I'd say the main purpose of it, is to place the institution of slavery and its legacy at the center of American history. And in the book, you present this historical project in opposition to Trump's White House Commission on American History, where I think, if I'm remembering right, he called it toxic propaganda. But it's
also Zinn. He also called Zinn.
Yes, Zinn is also on the burn list. Now, Zinn, though, doesn't, because what I want to point to is not Trump, who's throwing out wide swaths of historians, but in fact, that resistance to the 1619 Project did not only come from those associated with fascist history, but also from many left-leaning established historians, such as Sean Wilentz. And Wilentz has a book called No Property in Man, and in that he's arguing for the continued prominence and importance of 1776 as a key date because of its association with the aspirational aspects of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And I think in the book, you also argue for maintaining this aspirational framework, those parts you want to conserve. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the establishment critique of the 1619 Project, and whether this emphasis on slavery, enslavement, and its enduring legacy, which really is a history of recurring structural racism, placed in opposition to this other story of emancipatory progress. Do you think this is problematic for your own argument about the possibility of a progressive democratic history, or do you think there's a way you can kind of square the circle here?
Okay, you're asking several questions, one about Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project, and another probably more important question about how we think of aspirational history.
Well, I mean, there's an argument to be made that the 1619 project is a deep criticism of the not yet of aspirational.
I think that's a misreading of it. I think the 1619 project is soaked in aspirational American exceptionalism. I hope Nicole isn't listening.
Well, I would agree with that. But.
Right. So, I mean, it begins with Nicole Hannah-Jones's father raising black father raising an American flag, and on every day on the lawn. And then she said, I always wondered why my father loved America so much, and why black Americans fight so much in America's wars. Of course, this is an old idea that black Americans will fight in wars and then they'll be recognized as fully human, full citizens. And she says, the whole thing is about, how great America is, and its greatness is due in large part to black Americans. I agree, black Americans are responsible for a lot of great things in America, but the 1619 project goes further than that, and it's like America's the greatest democracy in the world. Sorry, I love America in lots of ways, in the way that's why I want to improve it. But I think the 1619 project is soaked in American exceptionalism, and the whole idea is. Black Americans were the central contributors, or certainly we all agree among the central contributors to the aspects that make America great, the culture, the music, the politics. So I think it was just a misunderstanding, and it was all just one sentence. Poor Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote one sentence that was that all of this focused on, which was, I forget exactly what the sentence was, but it suggested that one of the reasons for the American Revolution was to preserve slavery. And the whole thing is about that sentence. But as Greg Grandin, my colleague at Yale, pointed out, it's completely uncontroversial that the American Revolution, a central reason for it, was indigenous genocide. The king was not allowing Americans to move further west to conquer more land from indigenous people. So that's actually in there. That's one of the charges against the tyrant. So if the issue is whether America was born in sin, well, whether you focus on the enslaved population or the indigenous population, there's a clear argument there, a clear case there. So I think now, as to the general philosophical issue about whether we should have an aspirational model to improve our country. This has been litigated in the Black American tradition. It's Frederick Douglass's move. Frederick Douglass said, no, we're going to take against William Lloyd Garrison, right? William Lloyd Garrison says, the Constitution is a slave document. I believe this is right. And Frederick Douglass says in response, no, we're going to take the Constitution to be a freedom document. And we're going to take it at its word, and then we're going to present white Americans with their hypocrisy. And that proved to be a powerful move. And when I look at what's happening now, when I look at the Republicans who are saying this isn't a democracy, and when I look at, my colleague David Beaver and I, a linguist, once looked at Trump's speeches in 2017. We have a Washington Post article. And he uses the term liberty and freedom less than any politician ever, up to 2017. And he only used the term justice as bring him to justice. So this democratic vocabulary, if you don't have the democratic vocabulary, you're really losing a weapon that you can use to push for equality and the further realization of democracy. And that's what I think Douglass saw in a visionary way, that you can criticize America, but we have this deeply embedded vocabulary of democracy. And when you look at a country like Russia, or even India, what they're trying to do in India is they're trying to say, no, our identity is not secular liberal democracy. Our identity is Hindu, the Hindu religion. And so, you know, that's what they're trying to do in America. They're trying to say our identity is not democracy and freedom, it's Christian nationalism. and so I think the aspirational view has been litigated, and we should have the aspirational view. We should take these concepts seriously. And I think Nicole Hannah-Jones is doing that.
That's very illuminating, very helpful. I have one more question, then we can turn it over to the audience, because I'm aware of the time. And this has to do with, I mean, I completely agree that we need to have these rhetorical tools in this moment of actually political and ethical combat. But it also seems to be the case that we're living in a moment where certainly the authority, or I'll say the public confidence in the historian, but I would go further than that to say the expert in general, and you even see this recently with the terrible disinformation about the what can be done for the hurricane that has happened and is happening. An erosion of confidence in expertise, and in this case for certainly confidence in what historians are and what they do. And it does seem to be the case that this sort of pick your own truth or I'll do my own research has led people to find answers that coincide with their pre-existing wishes or beliefs, making this a really fecund time for something like fascism, because that's how people find the information. It coincides with some of these desires or wishes, how they'd like the world to be or that they fear it might be. And this is feeding, like the warm water feeding the hurricanes, is really feeding this storm that we see approaching. And so the big question, the million-dollar question that you do take up in the book.
I think you have to say billion now.
Is it what it would be $1 billion? Well, it's only worth $1 million when I'm dealing with it. I don't even have that. What can be done to regain the public's confidence? I mean, you talk about reclaiming history, but I think a key part of that, or I'm really interested to know what you think can be done to regain that sense of confidence so that those putting forth these rhetorical answers or these attempts to combat these really bad faith historical accounts, they're not even good faith accounts, they're bad faith accounts. How do we regain that trust to be able to put forward the work that you and I do in the universities, that public teachers do in education, that elementary school teachers are trying to do? How do we get the public back on our side as those trying to offer these tools to these people?
Yeah, the propaganda campaign against schools and universities has been extremely intense. You know, as Christopher Rufo, very, you know, a master propagandist who did the critical race theory campaign, he was like, you know, he's like, I'm not the one who called it critical race theory because it has nothing to do with the content of critical race theory. It's just, he said in a famous tweet, we're gonna call every excess of the woke left critical race theory. And then we're gonna call every institution that we want to take down. We're going to say from the federal government on down, we're going to say its ideology is critical race theory. So, which was very clever. It's like, you know, I'm sure many of you have seen the video where they're interviewing a guy and he's like, and they ask him, what do you think about critical race theory? I don't like it. And he said, well, what is critical race theory? And his eyes go a bit blurry, and he's like, well, I don't know what it is, but I know it's something I don't like. And that's what we face. We face a long-standing war against universities that I think is traceable at least to Ronald Reagan's governorship in California, when you had large-scale student protests against the Vietnam War, and you had, you know, you have a very explicitly intentional attack on universities. and it took the form of defunding them. And so then people have to pay more and more for universities. And when you pay more and more for universities, you really don't like them. You know, I went to SUNY Stony Brook, and I paid, I think, $600 or $800 a semester tuition. You know, like, that has changed, and Democrats are at fault too in making public universities the greatest university system in the world that people from all over the world send their kids to. You know, no other university system has this feature. Maybe the UK, but they're trying to destroy it too. So we, you know, unfortunately, the answer is, there's a lot of parts to it. We've got to make universities affordable again, accessible again, so people have less resentment for them. We got to get rid of institutions like Yale, because they create a structured hierarchical environment. I mean, I think Yale's a great place to do research.
Can we keep Wesleyan?
No. You guys are even worse. You don't have grad programs. I mean, I think these are great research institutions. You can't really have a university system as great and as singular as the United States without institutions that we have. And you can't really second guess it. Like, if you're doing something so right, like Nobel Prize winners, everything on down, our university system does right, and the world sees us that way. So you can't really question the structure, because, you know, you pull a thread, it might collapse. And, you know, the European university system has never recovered from World War II. So we have to somehow get the message out that we have the best university system in the world. And if you tell professors at the University of Indiana at Bloomington that they can't tell people about the banking system, you know, in America, you know, you're not going to have the best university system in the world. So the public school system, we have to explain the centrality of public schools to democracy. You know, it was Black Americans in the Freedmen's Bureau who created the public school in the South, you know, because you can't have a public democracy without public goods. The public school is the main public good. So, you know, first of all, we've got to address these things like affordability of universities. You know, University of Connecticut is a great university. It should be very affordable to everybody. So that there are these structural things, and then there's, again, emphasizing that, you know, we're a secular liberal democracy and not a Christian nation. Not, you know, just like India is not a Hindu nation, we're not a Christian nation, we're a secular liberal democracy, and public schools have this vital role to play in that system. So restoring faith in education and understanding the role that our schools and universities play in a democracy. I wrote this book because it's obvious why authoritarians attack voting. It's obvious why authoritarians want to replace the courts. But authoritarians always go after schools and universities as one of their primary targets and first targets. As Vladimir Putin said, wars are won by teachers.
That's a sobering answer. It does give us a sense of what to do. I think at this point I will turn it over to Jennifer to be able to pull people up to ask questions if they have them. Yeah?
Great. If anyone does have a question, we ask that you come here for the to the microphone. And look, we already have a question.
Thanks. So as you know, the state of Texas school board buys a lot of textbooks, and for that reason, I think they have a disproportionate amount of influence over the content of textbooks. Is that likely to change once textbooks start going more digital? And maybe they already have. I haven't been in high school for more than a dozen years, so what do I
in some, I mean, that's, so sometimes, I think I see the question. Sometimes people say, all this banning it's not going to have much effect because people can just go to the web. Is that sort of what you mean?
No, I mean that the textbooks, the textbook publishers have been sort of allowing textbook to drive the content because it's in their economic interest to do that, because they have to, because Texas prints so many books and they have a state curriculum. So I'm wondering if once textbooks start going more digital, if it could be more, if that would mitigate the amount of influence that the state of Texas has over textbook content.
Right, so that's absolutely right that, Texas and Florida have enormous influence over national textbooks. And given all these laws, that's really problematic. I can't answer the question about whether digitizing textbooks.
I guess only because I edit a journal, so I understand the dynamics of whether you're digital or print, and it makes no difference because the production actually is it costs almost the same. It's the delivery mechanism that's different, and so the pressures that are applied to academic journals, certainly to people making textbooks, where you have a kind of war between California and Texas as to who's going to drive the curriculum, and then you end up with niche textbooks trying to work either one. I don't see that changing because the digital innovation doesn't really change the economic situation and the subscription model. So,
thank you.
Over and over again, we see fascism evolving out of democracy. The public in general elects people who change the system to a fascist system. We've seen it in India, we see it in Hungary, and we've seen it all over the world. And even countries that haven't reached that stage yet, like Germany, the AfD, is almost the most powerful party in the country. And it's in France. Italy already has a right-wing government. How do you change what the majority of people want?
So this is the central question of democratic political theory, political philosophy, as I understand it. It's not a question about redistribution. It's this question. Plato, because we're talking about the classics, this is Book 8 of the Republic, where Plato says democracy leads right to tyranny. And Plato's argument is democracy prizes liberty, so anyone can run for office. That means scoundrels can run for office. Scoundrels will lie their heads off and tell people, divide the people and present themselves as the protector, and they'll win and they'll end democracy. And Plato, was a smart dude. And so Rousseau begins his project, his democratic project, by saying, nobody thinks this system can work because, and then he essentially repeats Plato without citing him. He says, some magician with words will simply divide the people and create, and then, so what Rousseau says is that you have to have a system of mass equality. And so people are not susceptible to resentment. People are not susceptible to thinking, oh my God, my life is so, there's no hope, there's no opportunity, it must be the immigrants. So Rousseau's idea is everyone, you remove the basis of resentment, and that, and not just economic, but also social. So that's Rousseau's idea, but he's long dead. I don't know if it works.
Hello. I was curious when we were talking about fascism that it didn't revolve more around anti-Semitism, because I feel like on college campuses, I've seen like flagrant instances of people like blocking campuses and blocking Jews like it was 1934 from going to class. And I feel like they're, like when it comes from like a leftist side, like if it's a right-wing Trump supporter, no one will hesitate to judge it. But if it's anti-racist, anti-colonialism, they seem to have a free hand to engage in anti-Semitism on campus.
I don't think that Jews, being one myself, are essentially anti-fascist. I think everyone can be a fascist. everyone can take, fascism is based on nationalism, and it's based on great replacement theory, the idea that, a country should be the majority of one group, and it should have mechanisms to make sure it remains a majority in that. And so I think there can be Jewish fascists, there can be Hindu fascists, there can be Muslim fascists, obviously. Hamas is a Muslim fascist organization. Iran is a theocratic fascism. So I think all of us can be fascists. And what's happening in most of the students I talk to at Yale who are in these protests are Jews, are Jewish. It's the largest among the largest identity groups in this. And so in a large part, this is a dispute between two groups of Jewish people, as we all know, as we Jewish people all know. And this is an old dispute. It's not a new dispute. So I don't think there are issues about, I've been a professor I'm only 40, but I've been a professor for 29 years. And I've seen many, when I was a college student, it was apartheid. It was South African apartheid. In 2016, it was Black Lives Matter on campuses. That was, when Peter Salovey, our president, said he was going to keep the name of Calhoun College, students shut the goddamn campus down. In 2016. And so I'm not seeing this. I'm seeing this as dividing my Jewish students into camps, and I'm seeing it as divisive. But I very strongly believe in free speech. I think that what we're seeing now with professors being fired, a tenured professor was just fired, a Jewish tenured professor was just fired at Muhlenberg College for posting something on Instagram critical of Israel. So I'm seeing, if you're talking about censorship, repression, people being fired and sanctioned, that's kind of fascist, and we're seeing that. So I think we're in a tough time, and it's a tough time, it's a tough political time, especially for Jewish Americans, I think, but also it's a tough political time for people in Gaza. And that's but I think we're seeing, what I see as a faculty member is fear of criticizing Israel, or else my job will be imperiled. And I think we're seeing that all around, and that's problematic.
Thank you.
Hello. Aside from education, what are the other levers that have proven most successful in preventing the rise of fascism and revisionist history, and what, if anything, as civilians, can we do about it?
Wait, can you say, I have trouble hearing.
How can we prevent, what are the levers that have helped prevent the rise of fascism and kind of stopped it in its tracks? Like, what can we do now and ensure that we don't go down the wrong?
I'm going to let you take this first.
Well, I didn't write a book about fascism, but I do think that there are things, especially in the world of revisionist history and bad faith, what I would call bad faith history, because there's several things going on out there. One are people who are trying to work through multiple perspectives. They're trying to figure out a certain, when you talk about writing history, there's something called emplotment, and that's sort of the story you want to tell, and the facts you prioritize are going to be based on the story you want to tell and who the actors you want to promote. And so, if you decide that what you're interested in is a moment of enslavement and its repercussions, and things start in 1619, and the facts you promote will follow from there. But if you decide it's about these great emancipatory claims, then 1776 works, and you can follow the history from there. And both of those are good, virtuous histories. But that's actually not what we're facing right now. We're facing people who are disingenuous, and they're bad faith actors, and they're making sort of false histories, but they're making them to look as though they mimic the genre of history. And I think these are the low-hanging fruit that we can call out, that this is the sort of place where we can attack, and we can attack vocally, because it's easy to demonstrate the way that they work in this way, that they're kind of a Trojan horse or a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that has been successful. I mean, at least from the academic side, it actually has worked on multiple accounts. The harder part, as you know, is when you're getting to the people who decide they're willful in their belief, and they no longer want to give up anything, no matter how much rational argument or proof or piling up more and more facts that you give them. That, I mean, the former editor of the Washington Post said, you know, that when that happens, then you just have to mobilize a vote where there are more rational actors than non-rational actors. So I guess that's the twin thing, getting the people you have confidence in out there to vote, and then attacking where you can attack.
Yeah, I mean, good. There's going to be people you can't convince. Like, as a Jewish American who believes in secularism, I'm not a Christian nationalist, you know, and there's a lot of people who want the United, and these are people who support Israel and Zionism, because if Israel's a Jewish country, America can be a Christian country. So, you know, you're not going to be able to convince Christian. I'm not moving from this country. This is my country. So Christian nationalism is like my enemy. And there's no convincing someone who tells me this is a Christian nation, Israel is your country or something. So there, you're just going to have to outvote them. But I think, so quickly, there's an ideological basis for fascism, and that's what we've been discussing. And there's a material basis for fascism. The material basis is people are frickin' sick of it. Their ordinary lives, the sick of the system is broken, and all that is true. So that's the material basis, but there's also this ideological basis. If you look at our education system, it's very concerning that we have the ideological basis. We have American exceptionalism, like in Weimar, they had German exceptionalism. But I think your question is more about what we do now, right? I think we're in this moment where people are being attacked, where individuals, if anyone tries to stand up for someone teaching critical race theory or their LGBTQ student, suddenly they're massively attacked as a predator and a groomer. So what do we do against these weapons? Well, I find, and I used to do this with Nicole Hannah-Jones on Twitter, when people are being attacked, defend them. The reason these attacks are so powerful is everyone wants to escape, and they think, oh my God, that poor person, I'm so glad I'm not them. But if we all are like, hey, I'm gonna defend that student too, you know, I'm going to film yourself making an apple pie for the person being attacked. That kind of democratic solidarity is what we need in this frightening time.
Hi, I think you mentioned that how difficult it is to be a teacher in this day and age. So if you were a middle school teacher or high school teacher, I mean, and you had a paper that you assigned your class to, what would you consider accurate sources of information that these kids could actually get?
Well, I mean,
he's a history teacher. Wow. I'm a philosophy teacher. They don't teach Plato in 10th grade.
I'm only sometimes a history person. But yeah, adjudicating sources is a skill that can be taught. And I think maybe that's the place to go. They have to be able to learn how, they need to learn the skills to be able to separate those false clues from the real ones. I mean, there are places one can go where there are, you know, verified sources, certainly peer-reviewed academic publications and journals. There are such publications that are targeted for either high school or middle school. They actually may be a better bet than the textbook industry right now. The textbook industry is so beholden to for-profit that they are less interested in, well, the academic process of peer review and that kind of making sure that the what gets out there has been vetted and you can be sure enough of it. I mean, things change. Short of that, it's really about on you. I mean, it's on you to get them to be able to adjudicate those sources, and that's not an easy job, especially in a world of ChatGPT, for instance, where they're outsourcing the ways that they want to find out information. So, although I would suggest you having them ask a series of questions to ChatGPT about things like consciousness, because then they start to learn the things that ChatGPT can do and can't do, and they become less enamored of it once they realize some of the major weaknesses. But
Thank you. Oi, ChatGPT.
Hello, my question relates to classical education. I majored in classics as an undergrad, and a lot of what we talked about was the lack of sources from other perspectives. For example, the role of women in classical times. Most of our sources are upper class men, so we don't really know about the contributions of women because so few things come through. How do you think about bringing forward these voices that aren't the main perspective or have been overlooked when these sources really don't exist, either through time or through suppression, and are more, if anything, copious in their lack? And how do you bring that into our preferred method of doing history, which is, of course, the story narrative? How do you input the fact that there is a silence in that story?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is what do you do? My agent is always like, stop talking about the problems, and I started explaining the solutions. I mean, I think, okay, I'm going to talk about the problems again. The situation is that there are oral traditions, there are populations that were cut off from access to written traditions, like women who weren't allowed to write or participate in written culture. So what the question is, maybe if I formulate the question, that'll be. The question is, how do we make up for that? How do we make up, for instance, the new David Graeber book, where he talks about how actually there were plenty of cities all over the world. It's just that the method of, they were made of what, clay? Or they were made of clay, and so they just disappeared. And so only very recently are we able to see that there were cities in South America, big cities in South America. Tim Snyder's very excited about Ukraine, that Ukraine had big cities. But, so it's just a total accident that the building materials of Athens lasted longer than the build. So, one way might be the Zen way, what I think, like reporting not on the individual, not having this genius sense of history, which is absurd anyway, but like talking about how people lived, entirely changing the frame, a frame that was, as you point out, a very 19th century frame, to change I'm trying to think about Thucydides, right?
Well, I mean, I would, so there was a historian named E.P. Thompson who wrote a book called The Making of the English Working Class, which really did change the frame, because that's history from below. But I do have an answer, because I actually wrote a book about this called Haunting History. The argument is actually to stop being so obsessed with things that are present and things that are there, and start training yourself to look for absences and being able to read against the sources you have. And there are different strategies for doing this. Saidiya Hartman uses a strategy called critical fabulation, where she realizes that all the sources that she has to tell the story of the enslaved are as property or as fugitives, and so she can't trust them in that right, and so she has to be able to extract from them other possibilities. It's not going to look like traditional linear history, but I don't think it should, because that's going to always be bound to a certain kind of narrative strategy. But I don't think the narrative's the problem. The problem is on that other end. There are ways to look in antiquity and read against it. It may require historians are allowed to imagine more. They're allowed to invent more. But of course, Thucydides, one of his his great breakthroughs was creating speeches. He didn't have the speeches, but he had the things that surrounded them, so he was confident enough to put the words in the mouth of those actors. And I think it doesn't have to be for Pericles. It doesn't have to be for great men. It can be for others too. And so shifting that lens in a radical way is one possibility. I think that's what we should be doing.
The first thing my father read to me was, you can tell he wasn't a good father of young children, but was Pericles' funeral oration.
But did he read you The Plague right after?
No, he read us Plato after. The plague, because Pericles died in the plague.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great irony. Pericles is this great summation about how wonderful democracy is, but of course, right afterwards, he tells you what happens to a democracy in a plague, which is everybody gives up on everything. They start thieving or whoring or drinking, or they decide to be ascetics. And so Thucydides is quite adept rhetorically in this way, because he shows you the summits of what a democracy can be, and also how incredibly fragile it is in the face of adversity.
Sorry, I'm talking about my family so much, but I read my kids Thucydides. That was the first thing I read to them. All of Thucydides during the beginning of COVID, during first year of COVID, or first 2 years. And my now 13-year-old said, at the beginning of COVID, he said, two things are like, during COVID, two things are permanent: plagues and slavery.
On that note, I don't know how I end now, but thank you, Jason and Ethan, for opening our eyes and our brains a little bit more tonight. And thank you all for coming out for this amazing interview. Copies of Erasing History are available for sale right here, and Jason will be signing. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming out.